The cold that morning had a particular kind of bite to it. The kind that works its way through wool and skin and settles deep inside the chest like something that doesn't want to leave. I remember standing at the edge of the dirt road, my breath rising in pale clouds, watching a shape in the mud that I almost mistook for a fallen branch. It wasn't a branch, it was a calf, a moose calf, no older than a few weeks, lying on its side in the shallow ditch that ran along the eastern pasture road. Its legs moved in slow, desperate kicks that went nowhere, like a dreamer trying to run and finding the ground wouldn't hold. I had seen animals in bad shape before. I had lived long enough in this part of the world to understand that nature doesn't always offer mercy. But there was something about the way that calf looked up at me. Those dark, wet eyes fixing on my face with an expression I can only describe as a question that stopped every rational thought I had. Its coat was dull and matted, clumped with frost and dried mud, the ribs pressing visibly against the skin with every shallow breath it drew. The mother was nowhere. I stood there and looked in every direction across the open field toward the tree line, along the road stretching north. Nothing moved but the wind. I knelt down beside it, and the calf didn't flinch. It simply watched me with those enormous, exhausted eyes, and in that moment I understood that it had stopped expecting anything. It had accepted that the world was cold and that warmth wasn't coming. That understanding hit me somewhere I don't have a name for. I was 67 years old at the time. My wife had passed 2 winters before. My pension barely covered the heating bill, and the small savings I had left were sitting in an envelope in the kitchen drawer for a reason I had been too afraid to think about clearly. I wasn't a man in a position to take on anything extra. Anyone in town would have told you that, and yet, I drove to Halvorson's feed store with that calf wrapped in an old blanket in the back of my truck. I spent what was in the envelope, every last dollar of it, on formula, on a heating lamp, on clean straw, and mineral supplements. The woman at the counter looked at me the way people look at someone who has made a terrible mistake they don't yet realize. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. By the time I pulled back into my yard, 3 neighbors had already seen me. Word travels fast in a small town, faster than anything else I have ever known. That evening, when I walked to the corner store for bread, a man I had known for 30 years called out to me from across the street. He was laughing. Not cruelly, he would have said, just with the easy amusement of someone who thinks they understand things better than you do. He asked me if I had lost my mind spending my last few dollars on a dying animal that the forest had already decided to let go. I didn't answer him. I carried my bread home and went back to the barn, and I sat with that calf in the yellow light of the heating lamp until its breathing steadied. The laughter outside didn't reach me in there. In there, it was just the 2 of us. The cold pressing against the wooden walls, and something fragile and alive choosing very slowly to stay. The first weeks were the hardest. I slept in 2-hour stretches, rising before dawn to warm the formula on the stove, carrying it out through the frozen dark to the barn where she waited. I named her Mara, after the river that runs north of town, because she had that same quality, quiet on the surface, but with something deep and persistent moving underneath. She was too weak at first to stand on her own, so I would kneel beside her and guide her legs into position, holding her upright until the muscles remembered what they were supposed to do. It took 11 days before she could stand without my hands supporting her. On that morning, when she found her balance and looked at me with those wide, dark eyes, I felt something shift in my chest that I hadn't felt in a very long time. The town, meanwhile, had made up its mind about me. I would hear it when I went to collect my mail, or when I stopped at the gas station on Route 9 for a coffee. Not always words. Sometimes just the particular silence that falls when a person walks into a room and the people inside have already been talking about him. I learned to recognize that silence the way you learn to read weather. My neighbor Carl stopped by one afternoon, leaning on my fence post with his arms crossed, watching me carry a bucket of fresh water to the barn. He told me I was throwing good money after bad, that the animal would never thrive in a domestic setting, that I was being sentimental in a way that didn't serve anyone, least of all the moose. He said it like a man who believed he was doing me a kindness. I told him I appreciated his concern. Then I went inside and finished my work. There was nothing else to say to a man who had already decided what the outcome would be. What those people couldn't see, what they never bothered to come close enough to see, was the way Mara grew. Not just in size, though that was remarkable on its own. She grew in her awareness, in the steadiness of her gaze, in the way she would turn her head toward the barn door whenever she heard my footsteps on the gravel path outside. She knew the sound of my walk. She knew it the way a living thing knows what has kept it alive. By the second month, she was eating solid food and moving freely around the barn. By the third, she had grown too large for the space, and I began letting her into the back pasture during daylight hours. She would graze along the fence line and then lift her enormous head to check that I was still somewhere nearby, every single time, as if losing sight of me was something she hadn't yet learned to accept. The people in town had a name for what I was doing. They called it foolishness, dressed up as compassion. They said I was confusing an animal for a companion because grief had softened my judgment. Some of them said it with pity, others with something sharper. I heard all of it, and I let all of it pass through me like wind through an open window, because in the evenings when the light turned amber and the air smelled of pine and cold earth, I would stand at the pasture gate and watch Mara move through the long grass, with a grace that seemed impossible for something that had once been too weak to lift its own head. And in those moments, I wasn't a foolish old man who had spent his last dollars on a lost cause. I was simply a witness to something that had refused to die. 3 years pass differently when you're watching something grow. They don't feel like 3 years. They feel like a single long season that keeps changing its light, its temperature, its weight. I watched Mara go from that trembling calf in the mud to something so large and powerful that the ground seemed to acknowledge her presence when she moved across it. She had the full breadth of the back pasture by her second year, and by her third she had developed the habit of standing at the northern fence line in the late afternoons, her great head lifted toward the tree line beyond the field, nostrils working at whatever the forest was carrying on the wind. I knew what that meant. I had always known it would come. Knowing a thing and being ready for it are two entirely different experiences. The morning she left, there was no dramatic moment, no signal I could point to and say, "There." That was when I understood. She simply walked to the place in the fence where the old post had rotted at the base, the one I had been telling myself I would replace for months, and she leaned into it with the easy confidence of an animal that has measured the world and found its boundaries insufficient. The post gave way without resistance. She stepped through into the long grass on the other side and kept walking toward the trees. I stood on the porch with my coffee going cold in my hands, and I watched her go. She moved with that particular grace she had always carried, unhurried, deliberate, as if each step had been decided long before she took it. She did not look back. I told myself that was a good thing. But the hours after she disappeared into the tree line were some of the quietest I had ever lived through. The barn felt different without her warmth inside it, not empty exactly, but altered in a way that reminded me of other absences I had learned to carry. I stood in the doorway for a long time, looking at the flattened straw where she used to sleep, at the marks her hooves had worn into the wooden floor, at the place on the post where she used to press her head when I scratched behind her ears. My neighbor Carl saw me fixing the fence that afternoon and came over to the property line. He didn't say anything for a moment, just looked at the broken post and then at the tree line, and then at me. He asked if she was gone. I told him she was. He nodded slowly, and for the first time in 3 years, he didn't have anything clever to say about my choices. That silence from him meant more than I expected it to. Not because I needed his understanding. I had stopped needing that a long time ago, but because it told me that even he had seen something in Mara that his certainty hadn't left room for before. Sometimes the world changes a person's mind without asking permission. I went inside when the light began to fail, and I sat at the kitchen table with my hands folded in front of me, listening to the wind move through the pines beyond the field. I had given her everything I had to give, and she had grown into something the forest was now calling home. That was not a loss. I repeated that to myself in the dark, and mostly I believed it. The ache in my chest was not grief. It was the particular tenderness that comes from loving something enough to let it become fully itself. It was the coldest evening of that winter, the kind of cold that doesn't announce itself gradually but arrives all at once, like a door swinging open onto nothing. I had gone into the north woods alone, the way I sometimes did in the late afternoons, following the same trail I had walked for 30 years along the frozen creek bed that cuts through the pines. I knew those woods the way a man knows his own house in the dark. But the ice was thinner than I had judged it to be, and the embankment steeper than I remembered, and somewhere between one step and the next, the ground made a decision without consulting me. I went down hard on my left side, and I knew immediately, with the particular clarity that comes only in moments of real danger, that I could not get up. The pain that moved through my hip was not the ordinary pain of a bruise or a stumble. It was something deeper, something structural, and it told me the truth without any hesitation. The light was already going. The temperature was dropping fast, pressing down through my coat with quiet, methodical intention. I called out twice, knowing even as I did it that the nearest house was too far, that the wind was carrying my voice in the wrong direction, that no one knew exactly where I had gone. The silence that came back to me was complete and absolute. I don't know how much time passed. The cold had begun to move past discomfort into something more persuasive, the kind of cold that starts to feel almost reasonable, that suggests lying still is the most sensible option. I was fighting that suggestion with everything I had left when I heard it. A sound in the trees above the embankment. Heavy, deliberate footsteps moving through the snow with a weight and rhythm I recognized somewhere older than my memory. She came down the slope without hesitation, enormous, steam rising from her dark coat in the freezing air, her great amber eyes finding me in the failing light with an immediacy that stopped my breath. 3 years in the wild had made her massive and sure, but the way she moved toward me, careful, measured, lowering her head as she approached, held something in it that had nothing to do with the animal she had grown into, and everything to do with the calf I had knelt beside in the mud. She positioned herself beside me and stayed. Her body was a wall against the wind, her warmth a physical thing I could press my hands against. I held on to her, and she did not move away. She stood over me in the dark and the cold, like something ancient and deliberate, and I understood that she had not come by accident. I do not know how to explain that understanding in a way that satisfies people who need their explanations tidy. I only know what I felt. It was Carl who found us. He had grown worried when I didn't return and had come out with a flashlight and 2 other men from the road crew. He told me later that when his light caught us, the old man and the moose, still as a painting in the frozen dark, he stood there for a long moment without moving or speaking. The other men went quiet too. Nobody said a single word about dollars spent or judgment lost or sentiment misplaced. They carried me out of those woods carefully, and Mara watched them do it from the tree line, not retreating into the forest until I was fully clear of the embankment. I turned my head to look for her as they lifted me, and her eyes held mine for one long moment before the darkness took her back. I have thought about that look every day since, not with sadness, but with the kind of gratitude that has no adequate language, the kind you carry quietly in the part of yourself that understands without needing to be told that some debts are paid in ways the world doesn't have a ledger for.